got to thinking, what are we going to do on the last Sunday of our Milestones campaign? And as we got going, and I felt that one of the greatest gifts that I could give you today was not me speaking. And you're like, amen, let's go. I felt like one of the greatest gifts that I could give you today was sharing with you the gift of a person. Paul and Pam Forbes have been family friends. Paul was one of my childhood pastors in Kansas City, Missouri. Don't look at his socks when he's up here. He's wearing Chiefs socks, all right? He was not bold enough to wear it on his shirt today, but he did hide it in his shoes, all right? He just, on this Texan soil, had to let everybody know who the champs are. But Paul was a childhood pastor for me, and I have to be honest with you. You know there are people that you could put on one hand that have had one of the greatest impacts in your life. Paul started investing in me when I was a teenager about what God was speaking into my life and helped me. I would not be a pastor here today. This church would not be here today if it wasn't for his investment. And him and Pam are some of the most generous people I know. One of my life messages, I believe, is on generosity. And I believe the Lord has wired that in my heart because he's modeled it for me through other people. It's not because we just wake up one day and we think, oh, we got this all figured out, and we just declare ourselves experts in the matter. It's because we watch other people go before us. And that is something that Paul and Pam have done for us. Paul used to fly helicopters in the Army. That was really cool days, huh? Got some good stories. And but he worked for Hallmark for several years. In fact, even internationally, he worked in Mexico for several years. He lived in the corporate world for a while before God called him to be a pastor. And that's where our paths crossed in Kansas City, Missouri. And he pastored for several years before joining a nonprofit Christian organization called National Christian Foundation. His job is actually a really cool job. He gets the pleasure and the privilege of helping people be generous with their life. And so that he helps people set up donor-advised funds and charitable funds that they can be generous. And so there are household products in your house sold by companies who partner with National Christian Foundation, and you don't even know that the item that you purchased in your home is actually doing kingdom work on the back end. And that's his job. That's what he does, is he helps people learn a life of generosity. And so would you join me in welcoming Paul and Pam this morning? And I told Paul first service, I don't know if I know how to do this. I'm going to sit down for the whole service. So if I'm standing up in a minute, somebody stop me.
We'll set you down.
There you go. You know, one of the things that we mentioned in the video is that there were people who invested in us being here. Paul and Pam are some of those people. Until today, he's never been to Magnolia, Texas, and didn't even know. Did you think it was Chip and Joanna Gaines' place?
Exactly. Are they here?
Yeah, they're not. Well, yeah, they're. If they were, this campaign would be done, right? Yeah. Let's just. My wife gave all the money to Target already, so yeah. Exactly. Sorry. Our heart this morning is to share with you about generosity, and I have to tell you that Paul and Pam really modeled that for us, and it all started when I was 15 years old. So 20 years ago, I'm 35. When I was 15 years old, I got a gift from Paul. Now, sometimes you get a gift and you don't remember what the gift is, but this gift has sat on my shelf for over 20 years. And I think it was around...
You're supposed to read it.
Yeah. Oh. Actually, I was really shocked when I opened it up. There's underlinings and things are circled. I actually read it. When I was 15 years old, he gave me this book around Christmas time, and he said, hey, I would love to meet with you and mentor you on leadership. I see what God's doing in your life, and I want to invest in you in that way. And I said yes at 15 years old by the grace of God. I don't know if it's because I wanted to take his daughter to the high school dance, or if because I wanted to read a book by this guy named John Maxwell. But Paul invested in my life, and I found this piece of paper. I don't keep a lot of paper these days, but when I opened the book up this week, I found this letter that you wrote to me in December of 2005. And there was a line in here that I would love to read. It says this. He said, you'll find over time that growth in every aspect of life requires work and dedication. Leadership is a gift. This is from a wise man, an old wise man right here. Right, I'm reading it right to you. Leadership is a gift and also a responsibility, one to be valued and one to be cultivated. And as I was reading that this week, I thought, wow, you're talking about leadership, but generosity is the exact same thing. It doesn't just happen by accident. We are not born generous. I know because I have a 3-year-old. And we are not born ready to turn things over, but it takes dedication. It's a responsibility, one to be valued and one to be cultivated. And so I've just asked Paul today to share about generosity and his story and what God has done in and through them. But I wanted to start today with the question of, how do you cultivate, if generosity doesn't come naturally, how do you cultivate a generosity mindset in your life?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and it's very humbling to be here and to hear this. Things I don't even remember, actually, through that. But as you mentioned, Clayton, it's like any aspect of our life. It takes exercise, it takes stretching for us to grow, and yet the word tells us to be sure that you excel in the grace of giving. And that is for everybody. And it takes work, and it's interesting. In our society, our culture today, pretty much everything is, out in the open, out of the closet, out on the internet, except money. Money is still kind of that one taboo topic that you don't talk about. And you have an amazing pastor here, because most pastors are extremely fearful of talking about this. And yet, the Bible says more about money and possessions and stuff. There are over 2,350 verses. And catch this, that's more than double of all the verses, all the teachings on faith, on prayer, and on salvation combined. And it's like, why in the world did God do that? Well, it's because he knew that that's an area that we would struggle. And so just working to lessen that grip. We are bombarded every day of, you deserve this, you need this, how about that break? And working to guard against that. Talking about the businesses, one of them I've had the honor to work with is David Green and his family, Hobby Lobby. And one of his comments that he's made, he used to say, well, you can't outgive God. You can't outgive God. And one day in his devotion time, it took him time to get there. So he wasn't born with it. It didn't come naturally. But one day when he was in his devotion, he heard this voice, and God said, well, David, you haven't really tried. You can't outgive God, but David, you're not trying hard enough. At the same time, God was speaking to his oldest son, Steve, and together they put together a plan for the family, and they did a stretch goal. And it's like, well, we'll see if God shows up, see if we can outgive him. And surprise, surprise, they couldn't. And then they did another stretch goal, and surprise, surprise, they couldn't outgive that. And God has showed up. And that's true for each and every one of us. And, if I would ask you all, if you've been in church at all, how many of you believe that God owns everything? Most of you would raise your hand. It's like, yes. The problem is, after service is over, I'm going to go out and get into my car to go to my home to eat my food and watch my Kansas City Chiefs and Pat Mahomes hopefully pull out another crazy victory.
Don't worry, I don't have to invite him back if y'all, so.
I figured this was my one shot. No. Instead, how about we think about it of how about I go and get in God's car to go to God's house to eat God's food. He loves barbecue, by the way. He loves Texas barbecue. And watch God's Chiefs hopefully pull out a miraculous victory. We'll see. And it's stretching in that way.
Yeah, I love that. And sometimes you can hear somebody speak on something and you're wondering, well, do they actually live that way? But I'll never forget, because when I was a teenager, he really instilled in me even, and I remember you interrogating me with several questions about who owns what. And I grew up on the lake. We spent a lot of time, our family spent a lot of time on the lake. My dad had a boat. I like to think that it was mine, but it was actually my dad's. But one of the things is we would spend a lot of time on the lake, and I'd say, oh, let's go get on our boat. And Paul would stop me, and he would say, whose boat is it? And I was like, my boat. And he was like, whose boat is it? I was like, all right, it's my dad's boat. He's like, whose boat? okay, it's God's boat. And I remember him having this conversation, and it may seem ridiculous or silly, but actually it still instilled a message in me that this doesn't actually belong to us. And if it doesn't belong to us, then we have to ask the owner what he wants to do with it. How does he want to treat it? How does he want to make use of it? And I'll never forget, because around those times we went to church camp growing up, and Paul was at several of those, and my dad asked me one day, he said, hey, can I go to church camp with you? And no teenager ever gets excited when their dad asks something like that. And I remember reluctantly saying yes, and he showed up, and then I realized because he had a boat, I now had more friends, so my life was better. But I realized you taught him the principle that this doesn't belong to the Lord, so you use it for things outside of yourself. And this week I got to thinking about that, because I remember you asking me that question, and about 50 kids a day would get on the boat on the lake at church camp growing up. And over 5 days, over the course of about 10 years that they went and did that, that's thousands, over 2,000 teenagers who were impacted by ministry that happened there, that got saved at Christian camp, that got, that heard all of this stuff. And it's because of the mindset that you were instilling in us that says, hey, this doesn't belong to you. How do you want to use what God has given you for other people,
Absolutely, and just amazing. And the dirty little secret behind that, you thought I was doing it to teach you, was also doing it to remind me. And get out of that mode really that it belongs to me. And just one other fun story. I've got 3 kids, and he did take my daughter to a dance and everything. We tried to do a prearranged marriage, his folks and ours. Sorry, Courtney. God knew what he was doing. But it get to the point, and my kids are just like anybody else's kids, and they'd get in an argument, and one of them, well, I'm going to my room. And then you could just hear the other two. Whose room are you going to?
So good.
Just a good reminder for
us.
So good.
It's a good reminder. Sometimes we can think that giving or generosity is only about money, and sometimes we can think it's only for the wealthy or for people who have extra or a surplus. And when we first got married, we had been married for maybe a year. You took a group of us on a weekend retreat away, and you asked us, hey, do you want to go to this conference, and we're gonna teach you guys, and then you said, hey, we're gonna put you up in a really nice hotel. We were all newly married. We're like, let's go, it's great. We couldn't afford a vacation at that time, and so it was a weekend away, but you instilled some things inside of us around generosity. And I was thinking about that. It's not because you thought one day I'd be a millionaire. And so you're working with young married, and I remember at the time maybe $1,500, $1,800 a month was all we were bringing in. And so it's not, you were not investing the message of generosity in us because we were wealthy and you wanted our money. And then you've worked with companies that are doing over $1 billion, and you find people on that spectrum, and generosity applies to both. It's to the wealthy and to the person just getting started. So why is generosity important for everyone and not just when you have life's money issues all figured out?
Generosity is a direct parallel of our spiritual journey, and it is a journey. You never arrive in that, but it is so universal because giving is at the very heart of God. There's a verse you may have heard of before. God so loved the world that he And you think about what he gave, the most lavish gift ever, so that we could live in eternity with him and have abundant life while we're here. Doesn't mean we're not without problems. But that's where generosity crosses the heart of God, and he tells us all to do it. And so I shared with you David's story. I've had, just been in a unique position to some of those businesses you mentioned, just to challenge them on the next step that God's leading them on. And I mean, millions and billions of dollars going into the kingdom, but they started in the exact same place that we all start. And you think about it, it's not about the numbers. So many times in the Word, somebody will ask Jesus a question. The rich young ruler, And he's asking about eternal life. How do I get that? And Jesus said, let's talk about your stuff. Not because Jesus needs his stuff, not that God needs our money, it's all his, but because it's a heart issue. And that's what he wants, is our heart. And Jesus tells the story, actually happened, it's not a parable, of the widow and her 2 mites. It's not about how much, it's about the heart that you give and the heart that you trust. Yeah. And that's what it's all about.
It's really good. Yeah, and that came out of Luke chapter 2, if you want to look up that scripture. But when a widow, Jesus says, giving less value dollar amount than the wealthy person, and Jesus says actually that offering was more generous than even the higher number. And it's just an encouragement to know, yeah, God is looking at something different than we are. And his heart is different in the matter. In fact, one of my favorite things, we have a widow that doesn't go to church here. She's in her late 90s and doesn't have a lot financially. And she gives every month to this church in a city that she doesn't even live in. And I think about that gift when it comes in, and it comes in the snail mail, right? You go to the P.O. box and you open it up, and every time I open up the envelope, I think, wow. Like just that God would use someone to give regardless of their financial position and what that does. And I just think about how the Lord would look upon that. You know, what does God think in something like that, you know? You worked with a lot of people who are generous. What are some characteristics of those people? Even last night you were telling me at dinner, I had to take them to some good papados, right? You didn't come to Texas, you know. And you were telling me last night even a story of a guy whose company he started, and in the beginning he wanted to be generous with his company, and he started and he said, hey, I'm going to pay myself a salary, and after the salary, anything the company makes is going to go to the kingdom. And so it started, the first year was $50,000. The next year, their company made $100,000 and given it, and now their company's doing over $1 billion, and he still lives off a $150,000 salary because he made the decision, this is how I'm going to live my life. What are characteristics that you see of generosity in people that you're like, that's something worth emulating, that's something worth pursuing?
Absolutely. I'll touch on that one, and I can share his name only because he's allowed it to be public. It's so interesting in that his name is Alan Barnhart, and you could Google it and hear some testimony. But he said he realized he had no desire to share things publicly. And he's like, I can't tell this. I'm not, it's not about me. It's all just about honoring God and giving to God. And then God spoke to him down the road and said, sharing your story is more about the stewardship of the story than it is the stewardship of the money. And because of him sharing, literally millions more have been multiplied into the kingdom as a result. But it all started for him in college as he was preparing. He was going to be an engineer, and he started reading the Word and talking about how money can be an obstacle, how it can make you fail, the idea of building bigger barns. And so worldly success, business success actually scared him. And he's like, what can we do as we start this business to put things in place so that doesn't happen? And so just that recognition, first of all, that God owns it all, that it all comes from him. From all things is the Lord's. So doing that, the folks that are on this journey are so humble because they realize that they're not that good. They realize that God has put them in a place and he's provided, and so many of them can point to a specific time where they either got humbled or on their knees. David Green, again, can point to a time and place where their business just rocketed because of being humble and realizing that God is at work here. Yeah. And it wasn't just coincidence, it was a divine appointment. Yeah. The last one in it, the two actually, is joy. There is joy in giving. Somebody said somewhere about it's more blessed to give than to receive.
Jesus, Paul.
Jesus, yeah. The last recorded words from Paul reflecting to Jesus.
Are you the actual Apostle Paul in the Bible?
I can neither confirm nor deny my
All right.
age on that. I'm not that wise. But another giver, again, is public, Clyde Lear from Learfield Sports, Learfield IMG. They do most of the marketing for most major schools. Start talking to Clyde about giving, and he starts shaking, not out of fear, but out of joy. He gets it, he's like, you've heard of a runner's high? I think there's also a giving high. It's so much fun. And these folks too, because God's entrusted so much, they know that they're also going to be meeting God at one point in the future, and they want to hear, well done, good and faithful steward.
That's so good. When you remember your wedding, if you got married, and you remember getting like 6 crock pots for your wedding gifts, everybody shows up with a crock pot for you, and I don't remember what gift you gave us, but they came to our wedding. They came to the great country of Texas, all the way from Kansas City, and showed up at our wedding, and you brought a gift. But one of the gifts that Paul and Pam gave us at our wedding was, he works for, they set up charitable foundations, and he set up a charitable foundation in our name, and they put money in that foundation and gave it to us as a wedding gift. And the beautiful thing about a foundation is you can't just do with it whatever you want. It has to go to a kingdom-building, Jesus-centered, God-fearing organization. And so one of their wedding gifts to us, I'm sorry, I don't remember what fork or spoon or curtain or toaster or whatever that you got us, but I do remember that. I remember that in our first year of marriage, you said, here, I'm going to help you be generous. I'm going to teach you to be, I'm going to give you money. You can't give away something that you don't have. I'm going to give you the money to give away. And that was something that always stood with me. I never forgot that, right? Gifts come and go, things come and go, but you did that, and it taught us, hey, early in marriage, it doesn't matter where we're at, we want to live a life of generosity. As people think about teaching their kids about being generous, or even if you don't have kids, but people in your sphere of influence, generosity is contagious. And so how do you teach your kids about generosity? What are some practical ways, or even just the people in your life, how do you help them catch the message of generosity?
Well, it's all by example, and had no idea that the things that I've been able to spend time with you would lead to this here today. Heard about the great grocery giveaway that you all did as a church, and the impact that that's already having in a community. And so teaching your kids, grandkids, neighbor kids, nieces, nephews is by example, and involving them in things like that are huge, taking them out on different mission activities, but also watching you give. I know for me, in our church growing up, it was, passing the plate, and so many, I'd see my dad always put the check in. At some point, it's like, he gave me the check and I could put it in. And then that led to allowance and me giving and doing that and just continuing to do that. And just like you teach kids anything, teach them about money, teach them about giving. Don't make it taboo, because it's such an integral part of life. And again, it doesn't matter the amount, but one of the fun things that we have done with our kids when they're younger, with our grandkids, and we need to start it back up again. But for us, we budgeted $100 a month, and I'd get a $100 bill because I wanted that 100. In fact, I still have one in my wallet today. God, what do you want me to do with it? But we involve the kids, and it's like, okay, over this month, what do you want us to do with this? Who do we need to bless? In some, again, our $100 could have been $10, could have been $1 million, but who do you want us to bless? And so many times if we'd be out at a restaurant, and it could be the server and the kid, Dad, I think it's him, I think it's her, give them the money. And we'd do it, and it was just a great time. Oftentimes we'd just do that anonymously and rush out of the restaurant as quick as possible. Sometimes we'd heard their story, and we were there, and then we'd hear the rest of their story and what this $100 would mean. It was just so powerful. Have you ever thought about tipping somebody at McDonald's $100? Well, you don't tip at McDonald's. You can. It's just fascinating to see what happens buying somebody's meal, buying somebody's groceries.
Yeah.
The key thing is asking the owner, what do you want me to do with this? Who do you want me to interact with?
Yeah.
And be careful, if you ask him that, he's going to answer you. And it's just powerful.
Really good. That's really good. I remember some of those. It's so impressionable as a kid when you're watching that. It's not just being modeled, but you get to participate in it as a kid or a teenager. And so, I mean, why wouldn't you want your kids to know how to be generous? You know, the world teaches them all kinds of things. I want to end with this question right here, but you know, sometimes when we give, the fear that can set in is, if I let go of this, what if I don't have enough? Or, hey, we have bills to pay, and if I do this. Or sometimes the Lord has, I mean, when we planted the church, the Lord asked us to give a number that we didn't think we'd be able to get to at any point in our life. And we're looking at that number thinking, how in the world are we going to do that? And the Lord's like, just do it. But there can be this fear of participating in that. And yet we know at the same time, and we've heard stories and testimonies of God coming through for people and providing in ways that we didn't even expect, whether you get a refund check or a bonus from work or something you weren't even expecting, and the Lord really provides. Do you have any stories or testimonies that would help us as we enter in this season? We're saying, God, we're stepping out in the water to do something that's bigger than us, and we're going to need your help. How do you rely on the Lord for that kind of help?
Practice. You don't know this, but my journey of generosity, our journey of generosity started with a campaign just like this. We had been faithful tithers. We'd grown up in the church. We knew about that. There was one time we got into some credit card trouble, and we skipped and we took care of that. But faithful tithers, and I thought that was the most you ever had to do. It's like, that's it. 10% to God, 90% to me. Can't wait to make my millions. Still give him 10%. And in a capital campaign, it's like, think about this, pray about this. What do you want to do? And we followed the advice, and we both prayed separately. And sure enough, God gave us a number, and it was certainly a stretch. And we looked at each other, and it's like, okay. And lo and behold, within the time of the campaign, God provided in a way that we would have never thought possible. Just to break the news to you, if you follow God on this journey, and if you do what he does in blessing others and looking outside yourself, this most likely is not your last capital campaign. This will just be the beginning. We did that for 2 or 3 of them, and one of them, ultimately, we prayed about it. Pam wrote down her number. I wrote down my number. She shared it with me. And it was a big number. It was a stretch. And it's like, how in the world are we going to do that with 3 small kids? Had started on the church, wasn't, kids needed braces, kids needed glasses, all this. And for the first time, our number was not the same. I shared with her my number, which was twice as much as hers. And she's like, okay, then we're going with the higher number. And through, some crazy things, one of them being a bonus check from Hallmark that they didn't even need to owe me because I hadn't been an employee there for 2 years, came through. And lo and behold, that's when George W. Was president, and they did this thing called the child tax credit, and it was like several $1,000s per kid. And within the year, God made up that number. It's like, who knew God could use the government to like make kingdom stuff happen? And so that's just been the case, and we've continued to grow and stretch and just work on that. He's challenged us on our retirement savings, a whole different story. But the key thing, and I shared this with you, my favorite Bible character besides Jesus is Joshua. And one of the most powerful stories is this story of the milestones and picking up the rocks. And if you've not done this in your life, I encourage you to do it. Think back over those rocks in your life where God showed up, and pull those out of the dry riverbed and stack those up as an altar to remember for yourself and for your kids and your grandkids. And through our capital campaigns and doing it, we outgrew the land and everything and moved 5 miles up the road. And I remember breaking ground on that property. They painted it out and had all of us families along there, had Pam and myself and the kids and a shovel, and we all broke ground together on the church that you grew up in. And I thought, I'm sorry, getting emotional, this is a time where I can give to something that is going to be so far beyond me. It's going to be a legacy and bigger than what I can do. Through that church was built. Hundreds and actually thousands have come to Christ and have been baptized. As a result of that, all 3 of my kids came to faith in the Lord, baptized there. Had no idea about this, but 3 weeks ago I got to baptize my 10-year-old granddaughter, saved in that church, and the legacy goes on and on and on. And I thought as I was up there at the baptistry tank, and I'm looking over and touched by the fact I get to do this. But Austin Hay, who was in student ministry at the same time, now full-time youth minister there, baptizing kids that he's brought to faith. Caleb Eisler, another one. I think about Brad Doherty. I think about Sarah Garrison on the mission field in a closed country. You and Ben, I'd never heard of Magnolia before. God working that legacy, that milestone, and him making a difference. And that's the invitation we have to be a part of his greater plan and him at work.
I love that. I love it. When I think about it, yeah, it's moving. And I didn't pay him to be here and say this. I didn't ask him what he's going to say. But I love the fact that you invested in something like this, and that's where I got saved. That church is where I felt called to ministry. That church is where God started putting seeds in me that this wouldn't even be here. And yet when we participate in something like this, it's so easy to see I gave, and there it goes up a wall, and there's the celebration. But it was never about the wall. It was I gave, and I put a seed in the ground, and for the next 10 years, 20 years, it grows, and I start to see fruit. But what does it do in 100 years? What does it do in kingdom time where God says, I'm going to do far more? I mean, we read the scripture all the time. I'm going to do immeasurably more than all you could ever ask, think, or imagine. So thank you for investing in me and in this church and for being a part of it. And he's one of those people who just jumped on the crazy train and said, I'm going to send money to this church that has 0 people and pray and believe that God would do something. So thank you, and thanks for sharing today.
My pleasure. Thank you. God bless you.